Okay, well, happy Monday, everybody. Thank you all for coming to class number two. I think there is a well, but it's nice that this is right after 4th of July because in some way, the fact that probably almost all of us did something for 4th of July this past weekend, and we saw this in no way as a conflict with our Jewish identity, is a modern Jewish idea. In other words, if we went back 300 or 400 years ago to anywhere Jews were living, it doesn't matter if we're talking about the Middle East, Northern Africa, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and you told people that in a couple hundred years in 2025, there would be a robust Jewish community in a far off land called United States of America, and Jews in mass were going to come out and celebrate the Independence Day of that nation, and they would also still have remained Jews, that would have seemed extremely far fetched because, as we talked about last time, the pre-modern period in Judaism can really be defined as these small autonomous Jewish communities. And this is because primarily the greater powers, which for most of the history, at least in Europe, was Christendom and the church, did not grant Jews anything that we would consider to be civic rights or equal rights or basic liberty or any of those modern ideas. And at the same time, the vast majority of Jews were happy to continue living in their small autonomous communities where, as a separate than big picture things like taxes and everything like that, the communities were self-governed. And so the example that I gave last time is that if we were pulling out of the synagogue and my car accidentally bumped into Shirley's car, we would not go to anything like a civic court. If we're talking about any country in the year 1700, we would go to the rabbis, and the rabbis would adjudicate it based off of their understanding of Talmudic civil law and also their understanding of something today we might call just what makes rational sense. And there's a lot to say about that, but this is not a class on pre-modern or medieval Jewish legal thought. This is modern. And so I want to start off today by introducing the Haskalah, and we'll talk a little bit about what the Haskalah is and what it isn't, and then we will see some excerpts from the most famous thinker of the Haskalah, Moses Mendelssohn. And so just to get our bearings in history for those that might have missed last time, we're talking about the 18th century, so 1700s, in Western Europe, primarily Germany, which was the birthplace of the Haskalah. The Haskalah generally translates to the Enlightenment, literally seichel in Hebrew. Seichel means intellect. And so, but people oftentimes use it as a term for the Jewish Enlightenment. It's not the exact same as the wider Enlightenment. And the Haskalah was really centered around answering two questions. Now, obviously, like most historic time periods that we hundreds of years later look back and say that was the time period of the Haskalah, the people that were going through it, it's not like they knew, okay, today's the first day of the Haskalah, today's the second day of the Haskalah. But generally, over the course of about 100 and 150 years, the Western European and eventually what became the American Jewish community went through a series of events that would make modern Jewish identity and thought and politics and religious identity completely separate and indistinguishable from something that we might have, say, in the 16 and 1700s. And so what were these two fundamental questions of the Haskalah? And we'll see how eventually this will connect to our celebration of 4th of July. So the two central questions were, one, how does Judaism as a religion adapt to modernity? I'm using my words very carefully when I wrote out these questions. You should all immediately have a light bulb in your head that goes off and say, well, wait a minute, Judaism isn't just a religion, in which case you would be absolutely correct. But the first half of the Haskalah is taking the religious elements of Judaism, which, as we'll see in the next couple weeks, is an enormously complicated thing to do, to suck out the religious elements from Jewish identity and place all other facets of Jewish identity to the side. But this was a major project of the early Maskilim, or the men of the Haskalah. So one, how do the religious aspects of Judaism adapt to modernity? And in this way, the Haskalah was very similar to the Christian Enlightenment, right? All of the ideas of, say, Copernicus and Darwin, individualism, and then later on feminism, and all of these movements of modernity that we would say clearly this is a modern idea that humans evolved from animals from billions of years ago, as opposed to God saying let us create man in our image 5,000 years ago. These questions were the exact same in the Jewish and Christian community. Jewish interpreters probably had a little bit of an easier time because of the legacy of Midrashic and medieval philosophy of already people like Maimonides who really paved the road for saying, well, is Genesis really literal? Is it more metaphorical? And so we already had a long tradition of that. But obviously, starting in the 17 and 1800s, these questions came in a lot harder hitting. Eventually, with the 1800s, we had Wellhausen and the documentary hypothesis. We already saw last week, starting with Baruch Spinoza, people starting to question the divinity of the Torah in general. And so this is one half of the Haskalah, and we're mostly going to tackle this question next week when we talk about Abraham Geiger and the Reform movement. The second half of the Haskalah that is equally important and in some ways, I think, more interesting because it's what distinguishes the Jewish experience of the Enlightenment from, say, your average Christian person, is the second question, which is how do Jews, now again, I'm separating Judaism from Jews here, how do Jews attain civil rights in local nation states? This turned out to be a much more complicated problem. And just to define this question, this is saying, there's obviously a group of people called Jews. Again, defining that is going to be one of the great problems of Jewish modernity. And still, you ask 3 Jews to define Judaism or what it means to be a Jew, and you're going to get 15 answers. And so for sure, at the beginning of the 1700s, when nobody ever had to worry about this question, this came in full force. And just by one way of example, oftentimes if you are in an environment, you never really think to define that environment, right? There's the old dad joke or rabbi joke, or maybe now that I'm a dad also, a dad rabbi joke where the younger fish passes the older fish and the older fish says, the water's great today. And the younger fish says, what the hell is water? And right, this really highlights the fact that when you're in an environment, you oftentimes don't question your identity and what the definition of that environment is. Only once you're pulled out of that environment do you ever reflect and say, there were some really interesting facets of that old environment. And so in the medieval period, when Jews were living in these autonomous communities, there was never really this question in the Jewish community, who is a Jew? What is a Jew? Everybody knew what a Jew was. It was every single person who lived in your same village or ghetto or shtetl. It comprised everything from religion to politics to philosophy to your way of life to culture, right? None of these terms even existed, right? There's been a lot of literature written about how even our modern definition of something like religion really only goes back to the 1800s or 1700s. And so Jews never really had this question before modernity, but all of a sudden, now that states were slowly modernizing and this idea of individualism and equal rights started popping up its head. Again, by the 1700s, there was no country in which Jews had equal rights in the early to mid 1700s. The first was in Europe, at least, was obviously France during the French Revolution at the end of the 1700s. But still, as states were modernizing, they started to look at these strange group of people. Of course, I'm talking about Jews who for the longest time had been relegated to living in the corner of the city. So if it's Berlin, there was a Jewish quarter. Paris, there's a Jewish quarter. Venice, there's a Jewish quarter. And all of a sudden, these countries and leaders and thinkers started saying, well, hey, if we're going to start conceptualizing of this whole area of France, and this is going to be a nation state, and we're going to be backed by some universal principles known as a constitution or Declaration of Independence, or, you could pick your favorite political document, we should probably try to figure out who all the different people and groups that are under our domain are. And for the first time, people began looking at Jews not as a collective, but as individuals, right? If people have individual rights, then it doesn't make sense to view Jews as a collective. You want to view them as not this is a group of Jews in a Zoom, but this is 25 individuals that are all here in the Zoom. And this ended up being one of the central questions of the Haskalah, so much so that you could almost hear the echoes of this question in our debates about Judaism today, right? One obvious example, the debate about Zionism, right, was obviously a question, right? The Zionist answer, we're going to see this in a couple of weeks, but just to, whet your appetite, the Zionist answer to this question is you really can't, right? This is a fool's errand, so don't try. Other answers said, no, you just need to keep trying harder. You just need to wait. Jews need to actually try to add to quote unquote liberalism of their host states to then eventually push these states to recognize that you should treat everybody as individuals. This debate is still running today in terms of the Jewish world, right? You ask a group of Jews, will Jews ever be able to be fully safe outside of the land of Israel? I'm going to imagine that question has, started many an argument before in Jewish communities, and this question goes right back to this period of the Haskalah. And so today we're going to talk about, again, the father of the Haskalah, the first Jewish writer to really systematically deal with these two questions. One other way of introduction, and then we'll pause for a minute to take any thoughts or comments before getting into the main chunk for today. The Enlightenment in general was really, in a lot of ways, in the shadow of Immanuel Kant, right? The great German Enlightenment philosopher. And Kant would have been well respected, not just by the Christians all throughout Germany and the rest of Western Europe, but many of the maskilim, again, many of the men of the Haskalah, were very much trying to live up to, and I'm going to, again, pick my language carefully, and we'll see why in a second, trying to live up to the challenge that Immanuel Kant sets forth for the Jewish community. And we talked about this a little bit last time, but I want to reintroduce it in a minute. So just to go over Immanuel Kant was all about this idea of individual reason and autonomy. He defines enlightenment in one of his early essays as man's emergence from self-imposed immaturity, and immaturity is the inability to use one's understanding without guidance from another. So according to Immanuel Kant, if you are unable to figure out what is good or bad for you to do without resorting to asking somebody else, that is the definition of non-enlightenment. That's immaturity. Now, this is going to be a big problem for a lot of Jewish communities, because Jewish communities in the pre-modern era were personified by, you had the rabbi. The rabbi had an encyclopedic knowledge of Talmud and subsequent halachic texts. And if you had a question, from a problem with your neighbor over, maybe whose fruit does it belong to you're having marital problems, to all the way you have a problem of whether or not your pot is kosher after you accidentally cooked the wrong thing in it, right? All of those questions would have been summed up as halachic questions, and you would have gone to the rabbi. The rabbi would have given you an answer, and 99% of the time you would have just accepted the answer, thank you, rabbi, and you would have gone home, right? So for Immanuel Kant, this is the height of immaturity and non-enlightenment. And Immanuel Kant sort of continues in this way, where he lays out what ends up becoming his most famous creed, which is the categorical imperative, where he states the only rational thing for you to do in any situation is something that you can will that it become a universal law. We discussed this a little bit last week, but just to run through it one more time, if I am debating whether or not it is moral or reasonable for me to, steal Fred's wallet, Immanuel Kant would say, well, I should ask myself the question, what if everybody went around stealing people's wallets? Do you want to live in that type of society? The answer, I hope, is no. Therefore, that's a universal law. Therefore, we can say it is rational and moral to say one should not steal, right? That is a universal law, right? But let's say that I think that people who happen to be born as Jews should not eat food some random day in October that we deem Yom Kippur. But should you eat on other days? Yes. What about people who aren't born Jewish? Oh, okay, they could eat. Immanuel Kant would say, well, this is not a universal law, right? This seems to make no sense. This is a dose of strange, subjective particularism into a system that should be fully rational. And again, this is the age of rationality and reason, and many of the early Enlightenment thinkers, Immanuel Kant being one of them, they believe, this is no longer a belief, by the way, maybe we'll discuss it at the end of class, of philosophers, but most Enlightenment philosophers believed if we only had enough time to sit around for years and years, maybe hundreds of years, and as our knowledge of the universe goes up, aka, science and philosophy, we should be able to delineate the perfectly rational and reasonable way for one to live one's life, right? In some way, many of the Enlightenment philosophers connected this to, Euclid's geometry, right? Just like if you sit around enough and if somebody gives you the angle of 2 out of 3 of the angles of the triangle, you will always be able to complete the triangle, right? They also believed the same was true with questions of morality and reason. And so for Immanuel Kant, what is stopping one from attaining reason, right? It's listening to authority. And he writes this essay called Religion Within the Limit of Reason Alone. where he really, takes Judaism to task. And he says the Jewish faith, as originally established, was only a collection of merely statutory laws supporting a political state. And so he says essentially, okay, we have Jews living in Germany and the rest of Western Europe, and these Jews are following a legal system. We'll call it halacha from now on, right? Jews are following halacha. But halacha is anachronistic. It's outdated, right? It's clear, according to Immanuel Kant, if you look through Jewish law, this is an outdated legal system of an ancient kingdom of, Judea or the Israelites or the Hasmoneans from thousands of years ago. And okay, yes, through the Mishnah and Talmud, the rabbis did their best to adapt it to medieval and subsequently modern times, but it's clear that this is sort of an outdated set of laws that don't really bear any relevance to our life today. He then goes on and says, whatever moral additions were appended to it, whether originally or only later, do not in any way belong to Judaism as such, right? He then goes on and says, well, if Judaism did happen upon anything that we would consider to be morality, then it was clearly only by accident, right? The main part of Judaism, according to Immanuel Kant, is following law, right? Halacha that oftentimes doesn't really abide by questions of, is this reasonable? Is this not reasonable? Is this moral? Is this not moral? And Immanuel Kant, again, sets in this challenge for Judaism. There's been a lot written also, the last thing I'll say about Kant, in terms of the, in terms of Kant's anti-Semitism. And there are, a myriad of statements that suggest that this was not purely intellectual for Immanuel Kant, but that he also did harbor some deep down anti-Semitic resentment. We have another quote in one of his other essays where he says, as long as Jews are Jews and circumcised, they will never become more useful than harmful in civil society. Now they are vampires in society. And so again, Immanuel Kant, writing in Germany in the mid to late 1700s, is saying that Jews, as long as they remain Jews, are never going to be useful to civil society whatsoever. So you had a mind as brilliant and as looked up to as Immanuel Kant, who in many ways much of Europe looked to for guidance for these new turbulent times of how to think about the world, essentially saying Jews do not deserve to be given equal civil rights because they are doing something else that makes no sense, right? Jews in some way are hindering Europe from reaching its full potential. Now, one other important comment that I promise I will pause in a second, which is today, many of us would find the question a little bit weird for Jews to have to argue for equality, right? Today, we are all lucky enough, especially in the 21st century, to be born in an environment where the default, right? Again, there's probably a little bit of nuance that could be added to the statement, but the default situation of somebody being born in America is that they have equal rights, right? For Jews in the 18th century in Western Europe, the default situation is that they didn't have equal rights. And so many Jewish thinkers thought that they needed, not thought, they realized that they needed to come up with arguments to argue for why should a place like France or why should a place like Germany give Jews equal rights, given the fact that Jews are clearly doing something else, right? Jews are clearly not living their life like the average Protestant German there. There were some Jews, by the way, who did take that route, who did in the 17 and 1800s say, you know what, it would be easier if we just completely took off our Jewish identity. Many Jews converted to Christianity in Western Europe in the 17 and 1800s. But what makes modern Jewish thinkers unique, and this is true whether we're talking about ultra-Orthodox modern Jewish thinkers or the most liberal Reformed Jewish thinkers, is they all rejected that approach of saying, well, I guess Judaism just no longer serves us anymore. And so modern Jewish thought is, again, really at these crossroads of trying to refigure out Judaism and also to answer these great challenges from the mainstream, from people like Immanuel Kant. Okay, I will take a minute for any questions. I see there's also one in the chat. So let me read that real quick. Go for it, Rhea. I think you're on mute.
Daniel, some of this with Kant doesn't make sense because Jews were judges and they were in high positions in society. So for him to say they're vampires, and of course people must have believed that and followed it and caused a lot of problems for the Jewish communities.
I might be wrong about this, so I will put that at the outset. I don't believe in the early to mid 1700s there were any Jews that had yet made it to that high position. This was at the crossroads when Jews were being able to enter those positions. Certainly 100 years later, you're right, and then certainly, obviously, it's no accident that, and I see Ramarsha asked a question also about why did Immanuel Kant care so much. There was a specific type of anti-Semitism that you can really see seeded throughout Germany, which was rooted in Martin Luther's anti-Semitism, right? The leader of the Protestant Reformation, where obviously, the general Catholic Church had their type of medieval anti-Semitism, but there's a lot to say of the strain of Martin Luther's anti-Semitism, right? Because just to go a little bit, Martin Luther, who of course, had been long dead, but Germany oftentimes, many scholars of the Holocaust will connect Nazi anti-Semitism through Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, is that every time a new thinker, so whether we're talking about Martin Luther with the Protestant Reformation or Immanuel Kant with the Enlightenment, right? We can kind of create a parallel. I don't want to create it too strongly, but they believed that they had the solution for why society was not progressing according to the optimal way. So for Martin Luther, it was, well, the church is corrupt. So now we're going to, go back to a pure religion, right? Scripture alone. And we're going to, all bask in the, glory of, the Bible, right? Both the Old and New Testament. And of course, once we do that, everybody's going to accept this new way of life. But of course, Jews did not accept it. And so they got a particular ire. And you can actually see this. Many Jews early on in the Protestant Reformation actually welcomed the Protestant Reformation because they said, oh my God, this is great. It was the hierarchy of the church that was doing most of the oppressing, right? So great, we welcome in a revolution. And then Martin Luther arguably becomes more anti-Semitic than any medieval church father at the end when he realized Jews were not a similar Immanuel Kant as well, saying, great, I have the solution. People just need to, live according to rationality and reason and universality. And oh, wait, the Jews are still doing these weird things like kosher and circumcision and Shabbat and everything like that, right? There was a particular ire around circumcision, for obvious reasons. Oh, the Jews, then the Jews don't deserve enlightenment. And so, this obviously carries on, but German society, it could be said, harbored this sort of unique steps of evolution of anti-Semitism until, obviously what happened in the 20th century, where we tend to read a lot of this in the shadows of what happens 200 years later. It's hard to imagine that Immanuel Kant would have welcomed what happened in the 20th century in Germany, but we can probably say in a lot of ways it was statements like this that led to this idea in society of, Jews are against the progress of our society and they are a hindrance and they do not deserve the same type of respect and equality of anyone else. Okay, Rhea, then Sydney, and then we'll go on a bit.
Okay, so I wanted to, you're probably going to bring this up about Napoleon. And so Napoleon wanted to, as far as I understand, place on Europe that they become countries. Everybody in it is a citizen of the country, and the particular groupings are not that whether you belong to one group or another doesn't matter, but the fact that you as an individual live in this now place called a country are a citizen. You are a citizen of that country. And so it's about the same time. Am I right?
Yeah, so Napoleon's a little later. We'll probably discuss Napoleon next week. Napoleon did sort of exactly the other side of this, where Napoleon, you're right in the fact that he said, well, everybody should just be French, everybody should just be individuals, but the cost for the Jewish community was enormous. Napoleon instituted in the early 1800s when he convened all the rabbinic leaders around France and asked them a series of very pointed questions of, are Jews allowed to marry non-Jews? Do Jews have loyalty to, non-Jews, or do they just have loyalty to Jews? Do Jews, are Jews allowed to, as a Jewish doctor, Are they allowed to treat non-Jews, right? So it was very much, Napoleon definitely did grant equality to Jews in terms of, I would feel comfortable with that rough statement, but it was at a cost. It was at a cost of other facets of Jewish identity, a lot of stuff that we'll see next week. So yes, Napoleon is very much here. Moses Mendelssohn is before. And so something like, the Jewish Grand Sanhedrin, which is the group of rabbis that Napoleon configured, if it wasn't for Mendelssohn, they would have been a lot more lost. And so, the rest of the Haskalah, and again, Moses Mendelssohn is an interesting figure because you can make a credible argument that he was the father of almost any subsequent Jewish movement. And so he's a fascinating figure. I'll introduce him more thoroughly on the next slide. But yes, in a lot of ways, Mendelssohn sort of paves the path for what eventually happens in France and then Germany and then other places and, certainly America as well. All right, Sydney, go for it.
I just wanted to say, I think that Kant was also very critical of the Catholic religion, which has a lot of the same trappings as Jewish religion. In that, there's even worse where you have the Pope, who is divinely granted all the knowledge and makes all the final decisions and has all kinds of, strange traditions and so he also was attacking a lot of that. And Germany especially looked at Protestantism as the right way and the modern way.
Certainly. And also, if we go east enough, Protestants and Catholics, had many wars against each other as well. The difference was that generally, and this will be interesting because this will inform mid 1800 solutions for, in the Jewish community, proto-Zionist solutions. Despite the fact that Protestants and Catholics, had many wars against each other, they still each had states where they were the majority. And so there was always, again, not that this is the best solution for, your neighbors all hating you, but if you were a Catholic living in Germany or, a Lutheran living in, Switzerland, whatever the combination, you can always say, I'm going to move to where I'm a majority. And that would be a solution, right? For Jews, obviously in the 17 and 1800s, there was no solution yet to say, well, I'm going to kind of give up, right? It kind of seems like it's taking France or Germany a really long time to give me equality. I'm just going to go to, the Jewish state, right? Which will obviously, that's a very, we're about 150 years too early for that conversation now. But that very much is bubbling up under the surface. Okay. Who was Moses Mendelssohn? He was, not particularly part of any great lineage. All we know, his father was relatively poor, guy named Mendel, right? Son of Mendel. He had a traditional yeshiva upbringing, and he really spanned, the middle of the 1700s. A couple things to say about Mendelssohn before talking about his two works, and we'll read through at least one of his magnum opus called Jerusalem. Moses Mendelssohn, contrary to a lot of the popular press that he gets, lived his life 100% as an observant halachic Jew. And so because he was the father of the Haskalah, that ends up leading to a lot of less halachic-based Jewish movements, such as the Reform movement and such as Zionism and such as a lot of Jewish socialist movements that would all take place over the next 100 years, very much in the shadows of Moses Mendelssohn. He, in his own writing and his own life, made extremely clear that Jews still had to keep Jewish law. And, we'll see a little bit of his argument for that in a moment. And Moses Mendelssohn, writes this book called Jerusalem. It's really his magnum opus. And there's two completely different messages. And one of the interesting things before I go into the messages is that Moses Mendelssohn is living his life and his writings are primarily based on two completely different audiences. And you'll be able to see this really clearly when we go through some of the primary text. Half of Moses Mendelssohn's writings are meant for Jews, right? He was a Jewish leader writing for other Jews. And half of it was written for the Christian majority. And he never tells you, like all great writers, he's not saying, okay, this paragraph is meant for the Jews. Okay, this paragraph, if you're a Christian, skip to page 12, right? Obviously. But very much in his writings, right? And this is also what starts to make Mendelssohn unique, which is there had been great Jewish thinkers before Moses Mendelssohn, but the vast majority of them were not interested in writing to a non-Jewish audience, right? Sure, I'm sure Moses Maimonides, if, a Muslim were to pick up his work, he wouldn't be upset, but we can't say that Maimonides wrote his book hoping that a lot of Muslims or Christians would read it. With Moses Mendelssohn, it's the opposite. And what really makes Mendelssohn a modern thinker is this is the early age of cosmopolitanism, where he really did both care and also he had a polemic to push in terms of wider Europe, right? I'm not saying polemic is a bad thing, right? His polemic in this case is very good. But it's clear that in his writing, he wants both Jews and non-Jews to read it and for them both to get different things out of it. So what is his primary argument in Jerusalem? He's one of the first figures to really argue for a classical separation of church and state, like we have now. Mendelssohn is also one of the few modern Jewish thinkers that is, or at least at the time, was equally seen and respected as a modern thinker, not just a Jewish thinker. In other words, very few people today are going to read Abraham Geiger or Theodor Herzl outside of the Jewish community just for their wealth of philosophic or political knowledge. With Mendelssohn, his arguments of separation of church and state really struck a chord with many across Europe, and he quickly became very well known outside of Jewish circles. And in this, he, was writing to both Jewish and Christian audiences, but what he was trying to push was very different. For Christians, he was trying to make the argument you have to let Jews remain Jews and also grant them equal rights, right? It seems like a very simple, obvious argument, but this is the first time a Jewish writer really tried to systematically defend this idea. Why should Germany both let Jews remain Jews, right, not force assimilation on them, and also grant them equal rights? We'll see his answer to that in a second. And at the same time, for Jews, he's saying, hey, if we want Judaism to modernize and we want to be granted civil rights, we have to begin to separate these two things that had never been separated before in Jewish history, right? To get back to the medieval example, if I hit Shirley's car pulling out of synagogue on Friday night, there would be no question that that would be of the same sort of question in the medieval ages as if I accidentally cooked cheese in my pot that was meant for meat, right? They were both just Jewish questions. They were halachic questions, right? There wasn't this separation of civic and religious, right? Both cases, we would ask the rabbi. In both cases, it would be a religious or halachic obligation to listen to the answer. All of a sudden, Mendelssohn starts to make the argument for the Jewish people. You're really going to have to start to separate it. You're going to have to say, yes, if you trafe up your pot, right? You accidentally cook, hot dogs in your milk pot. Yes, that is a religious question, and that goes to the religious leader, aka a rabbi. You accidentally bump into somebody's car leaving the market on a Tuesday, that's no longer a halachic question, right? Forget that category. Yes, we do understand that the Talmud has hundreds of pages of dense civic law material, and the halachic responsa has tens of thousands of pages of civic law material, but forget that, right? That actually bears no more relevance, right? Just the same way that we have thousands of laws of sacrifices in the temple and they are just obsolete, right? It's still interesting to learn about it. Maybe there's even a religious, imperative to learn about it because it's part of our history and values and whatever. The same way, yes, still study the tractates of Talmud, Baba Metzia, Baba Batra, right, that deal with civic and tort law, but no more should Jews live in these enclaves where they're asking their rabbi. Why, right? It's a pretty easy argument. Because if Jews want to eventually be mixed up in the mainstream, if I bump into a non-Jewish person's car leaving the market, he's probably not going to care what the Talmud has to say about who owes who what, right? He says, well, let's go to the court system, right? What court system? This new court system based on Kant's view of reason and rationality, and maybe depending on what time and what country, right, a constitution or legal code. But this was a tough argument for Jews to swallow because for 1700 years since the destruction of the temple, Jews essentially had to self-govern themselves in all of these ways, and halacha evolved to create a system where these laws were one of the same, right? There would not have been, right? I can't stress this enough that there would have been no difference in terms of the genre of question of I have a question of what constitutes a kosher eruv on Shabbat and how much do I need to pay Philip if he's trying to get out of a contract because we had planned to go into business together, right? These questions were both halachic questions that were dealt with by the Talmudic halachic tradition. All of a sudden, Mendelssohn is saying, okay, great, but enough of that. Let's see a little bit of Mendelssohn's inside. So this is the end of his book, Jerusalem. And I'll try to make this full screen. Perfect. Okay. So one of the interesting things, and I highlighted some interesting excerpts, and then we can discuss and then have a little conversation about it. Again, keep in mind the dual audience, right? He's writing this both to Jews and to Christians at the same time. So here's how he starts. He says, I have said that the Mosaic Constitution did not last long in its original purity. So what's he saying? He's saying that, well, originally the Mosaic Constitution, aka the Torah, right? That the Torah never lasted long in its original purity, right? This is not a new idea. This is an old idea that goes back to medieval Jewish thought, where he says, the ideal state laid out by the Torah was very short-lived, right? And what's his proof that this was short-lived, right? He goes all the way back to the prophet Samuel, and what happens in the prophet Samuel's time? The people, the Israelites, decide to ask for a king, right? And so they ask Samuel to ask God to grant the Israelites a king, and Samuel and God sort of have this internal freak out, excuse the, language here, and they say, well, wait a minute, you're not supposed to have a king. God is your king, right? You don't need a king, right? A king is for other nations that don't have the Torah. But the people beg and beg and beg and say, please, can I have a king? And finally, God relents and essentially tells Samuel, the people have rejected me, but fine, give them a king. This, for Mendelssohn, constitutes some ancient split where you had this ideal Judaism, ideal Torah, but even from the time of the Bible, right, the Tanakh, this ideal type of Jewish living was never actually fully lived, right? Because this idea where you're going to have a king, which for Mendelssohn is going to constitute the state, and you're going to have the prophets and priests, which are going to constitute the church, right, religion, right? This was a long split for Moses Mendelssohn dating back to the Hebrew Bible, right? He then goes, right, and, I'm just reading the yellow here. He says, the people persisted in their resolution, got their wish, and experienced what the prophet had threatened them with. In other words, the people complained, we want a king, we want a king. And finally, the prophet gave them the king. With that, the Constitution was undermined. The unity of religious and governmental interests was abolished. State and religion were no longer the same, and a conflict of duties was no longer impossible. So Mendelssohn is saying, you're right. In some ideal situation, there would be no such thing as separation of church and state for Jews. Again, this is what he's writing for Jews. He's saying, I get it. I get that you want to bring your tort cases to the rabbi. But already thousands of years ago, this idea that all of life is going to be governed, both the religious and the politics, through the Torah, that's outdated. We even see that in the Hebrew Bible, where that wasn't the case anymore. Right now, in the modern period, right, and he's considering modern everything after the prophet Samuel, right, which is quite a long time ago, right, Judaism does recognize a separation of state and religion, or church and state, right? This separation that many think is impossible, right, even our Hebrew Bible deals with this. Are people able to see, by the way? Someone just typed in that they don't think I'm sharing the screen. I just want to make sure everyone can see the
You are. I can
text.
see.
Oh, okay. Perfect. Philip, you might need to toggle to the other tab. Perfect. Okay. So we'll keep going a bit. So he then traces a history here, and you can kind of see him switch tones here as well. This is a very interesting conceptual choice that he makes. He says, but now track the events through all sorts of ups and downs and changes, through many good and bad regimes, God-fearing and godless ones, down to the sad period in which the founder of the Christian religion gave the cautious instruction, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's, right? He says, this history of separation of church and state, you can draw a straight line all the way down to the New Testament, right? The famous statement of give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's, right? The ultimate creed, at least in Mendelssohn's mind, of a separation of church and state, right? He then goes on to say, well, this is terrible, right? In some way, in some idealistic way, this is terrible to have to separate church and state, right? He goes on, he says, to each his own, since the unity of interests is now destroyed, right? But he eventually says, we have no choice, right? We're living in a non-ideal world right now. And the fact that we're living in a non-ideal world, we have to get over the fact that religion and state are separate. And he says, and now that is the best advice that can be given to the house of Jacob, aka the Jews. Adapt yourself to the Sidon. The Sidon is his short term for, the morals and philosophy of Kant, and the constitution of the land in which you have been placed, but hold fast to the religion of your fathers too. Bear both burdens as well as you can. So Kant is saying, okay, for thousands of years, church and state have been separated. Jews, right? You still have to follow both, right? But separate the two, right? Understand that there's some things you do for civic reasons and some things you do for religious reasons. And you have to bear both burdens, right? Both sides are important. But this is the state of the situation now. He then goes on to say, it is true that on the one hand, the burden of civil life is made heavier for you because of the religion to which you remain faithful. And on the other hand, the climate of opinion and the times make the observance of your religious laws in some respect more irksome than they need to be, right? In other words, he's saying, I get that this is really hard, right? You are being denied civil rights because of your allegiance to Judaism, and Judaism is now made harder because of your welcoming into civil rights, right? People are going to think you're weird for saying, I'm so sorry I can't come to the office next week. It's Sukkot, right? And also at the same time, Jewish law is now endlessly tethered through, is it religious? Is it civic, right? Every time I officiate a wedding, I sort of reflectively am aware of this, because when you officiate a wedding Jewishly, you're signing two completely different marriage contracts, right? You're signing the ketubah and you're signing the California marriage license. And, right, which, for what wedding do you sign two completely different contracts from two completely different legal systems, right? It's a crazy thing that we do. But Mendelssohn is saying, do it, right? He's saying, in fact, I don't see how anyone born in the house of Jacob can conscientiously free himself from the law. In other words, part of being Jewish, according to Mendelssohn, right, this is going to be challenged next week, is keeping Jewish law, right? He then goes on a lengthy paragraph and he says, yes, throughout Jewish history, you can debate about the meaning of the law and the philosophy of the law and all of these things. But at the end of the day, you have to follow the law, because then, and I wanted to, I didn't underline a lot here, but he basically says, it's a weak and short-sighted thing to do to say that I understand all of God's ideas, and so therefore I don't need to follow the law anymore. And so he eviscerates people in the Jewish community that were at this time becoming more lax in their observance of Jewish law, or even converting to Christianity because of their view of religious and civic nature. But then look at how he switches, right? So this is now interesting. Now he's clearly switching and talking to the Christian majority here, right? It's one of the fascinating things about Mendelssohn, where you can kind of almost go line by line and highlight, who do you think this line was meant for, Jews or Christians? So here's what he says. So after telling Jews why Jews need to keep practicing Jewish law, he then says, Jesus of Nazareth, right? Clearly you're evoking Jesus. This is probably not meant for Jews, right? Jesus of Nazareth was never heard to say that he had come to release the house of Jacob from the law. Indeed, he explicitly said the opposite, and what's more, he did opposite. He obeyed not only the law of Moses, but the ordinances of the rabbis. He's saying, well, Jesus, right, quite an important figure in, the Christian eyes, he never explicitly said that he was coming to abolish the law. Yes, that happened later. That happened with Paul. But Mendelssohn's going to argue that Jesus was actually a halachically observant Jew. This argument's going to be echoed. We're not really going to have time to go into this next week. But Abraham Geiger, the founder of Reform Judaism, is going to write an entire book about the Jewish Jesus, right? He's going to try to re-Jewify Jesus, right? Very much following the same conceptual background. But Mendelssohn is saying to the Christian majority, your leader, right? Your God, right? Jesus, he himself lived his life as an observant Jew, right? He then goes on to say, if his followers later on thought differently, believing that Jews who accepted their teaching could be released from the law, this surely happened without his authority. And you, dear brothers, dear fellow men who follow the teachings of Jesus, should you find fault with us for doing what the founder of your religion did himself and confirmed by his authority? Should you believe that you can't love us in return as brothers and unite with us as citizens as long as we are outwardly distinguished from you by the ceremonial law? We don't eat with you, we don't marry you, which as far as we can see, the founder of your religion wouldn't have done himself, nor allowed us to do, right? What an incredible statement. He's saying Jesus himself, if he was living in Germany in the year 1770, whatever year he wrote this, he himself would have kept kosher and would have only wanted to marry a Jew and all of these things. So don't give us a hard time, right? You know, Christian majority, for doing what the founder of your religion did his entire life, right? He then goes on to say, if you won't allow civil union unless we depart from the laws that we still considered binding on us, then we're sorry to have to tell you we would rather do without civil union, right? So he's saying, if still at the end of this, I can't convince you that Jews should be granted equality and equal rights under the law because they're still following this sort of outdated Mosaic code, well, I'm so sorry to tell you, right, we are going to choose Judaism over political and civic equality, right? This is what's going to, by the way, distinguish Mendelssohn from a number of other modern Jewish thinkers who were actually willing to make the trade, right? Explicitly in the 1800s, many Jewish thinkers were willing to say, we will consider Jewish law no longer binding because that's going to lead us for civil equality quicker. But Mendelssohn, writing this, again, really being the father of the Haskalah movement, he's saying Jewish law is important, right? Civic law for Jews is important, and Jews should adopt both. And for Christians, you should really understand why Jews want to continue practicing Jewish law. At the end of the day, even the founder of your religion was practicing Jewish law. And if you make us choose, we're going to remain Jewish even without civil union. He then tackles one more theme towards the end of his book, Jerusalem, where he says, well, what about quotes, messianic quotes, such as in John 10, that say that at the end of the day, there's only going to be one shepherd and one flock, right? And you can tell, right, throughout Mendelssohn's life, he was in touch with many Christians. Actually, at the end of his life, he was publicly challenged to a debate where somebody said Mendelssohn should accept Christianity, and he refused, and he actually ended up in this public correspondence with a Christian friend of his, right, who I think eventually became his enemy, in his refusal to just convert to Christianity. And he's saying, right, he's answering people that say, well, what about messianic ideas that one day everybody will just be the same, right? He then gives his, famous, and this is probably the most famous line in Mendelssohn, and then we'll summarize. He said, if a union of faiths ever did come about, its consequences would be disastrous for reason and freedom of conscience. So now he goes back to Kant, right? This is a very clever tool that he uses, right? He's now saying, right, if, as Christian thinkers want, which one day everybody thinks the exact same and believes in the exact same things, that would actually have disastrous consequences for reason and freedom. What would that accomplish? Everyone thinking alike concerning religious truths? No one who has any conception of the nature of the human mind would draw that conclusion. The only agreement would be in the words, in the formula. That's what the unifiers of faith join forces to achieve. They want to squeeze something out of the concepts in some places to broaden the web of words in other places, making the words so uncertain and broad that intrinsically different concepts can be forced into them just barely. Oh, if this universal hypocrisy had any purpose, I'm afraid it would be intended as a first step towards putting the now liberated spirit of man back into prison. In other words, what if we did all believe the same thing, right? What if you did get the entire world or East or Western Europe to accept Christianity? People are different. People have different beliefs. And so we can say we all believe the same thing, but we're going to end up having terms that are so loose and so liberal without any meaning that none of us are actually going to think anything. There's just going to be this general web of mush going around. And then he ends with sort of a mic drop at the end. He says, if you care for true piety, let us not pretend to agree where providence's aim is obviously diversity. None of us thinks and feels exactly like his fellow man, so why do we want to deceive each other with delusional words? Why, in the most important concerns of our life, should we put on masks to make ourselves unrecognizable to each other, given that God has, for his own reasons, has stamped everybody with his own features? If the link between the legal system and opinion is too deeply dug in and the time is not yet ripe for abolishing it completely without great risk, try at least to mitigate as much as you can its pernicious influence and to put wise limits to prejudice that has grown gray with age. And then this is the end of his entire book. He says, let no one in your states be a searcher of hearts and a judge of thoughts. Let no one assume a right that the omniscient has reserved to himself alone. If we give to Caesar what is Caesar's, then you should give to God what is God's. Love truth, love peace. So Mendelssohn sort of takes us on this conceptual roller coaster, right? And again, he's obviously very well read because he's quoting, Jewish sources, he's quoting Christian sources, he's quoting Enlightenment sources, and he's making this sort of multi-pronged argument where he's telling Jews, right? And we'll see in his other major work, the Bior, which was really fully meant for Jews. He's telling Jews, hey, you have to start to modernize a little bit and to accept civic law and to learn German. That was a big part of Mendelssohn's push to the Jewish community. This was a Jewish community that still mostly spoke Yiddish. And so he was telling Jews, hey, you have to start to learn German and you have to start acculturating yourself to wider German culture, right? Start dressing like Germans, right? So he was definitely pro-cultural assimilation, right? Not religious assimilation. But his argument to the Christian community is the two things you claim to care about, Christianity and reason, will both be hampered in some way if you force Jews to choose between religion and state. He says, for a long time, both Jews and Christians have recognized that church and state constitute two distinct realms of thought. Now, this is interesting because for Christians, he's right. For Jews, he's almost certainly not right. Meaning, before Mendelssohn, there were almost no Jewish thinkers that would have said what Mendelssohn said, which is there's the realm of the political and there's a realm of the religious. For Mendelssohn, he's saying, yeah. Jews for a long time have recognized this. Since the prophet Samuel, that we have what's called religious Judaism and what's called being a civic, American. And these two things are not in conflict at all, right? I started today by saying, the celebration of 4th of July would have seemed, crazy to Jews in the 15 or 1600s, but Mendelssohn really paves the path for where not only does it make sense, but Mendelssohn would be happy to hear that Jewish communities had 4th of July celebrations throughout the weekend and still celebrated Shabbat, right? For Mendelssohn, this was key. Understanding that Shabbat is a religious obligation, it's a Jewish obligation, and you were still bound by the religious law. But in terms of our Americans, and we all speak English, I hope, otherwise this would be very ununderstandable, right? We all speak the language of America. We all celebrate American pastimes and holidays. We all utilize and trust, I hope, the American court system and legal system. And all the while, that does not detach from our Jewishness, right? Our Jewishness can still be completely intact. Again, Mendelssohn would say that Jewishness has to be underlined by a strict halachic observance. Now, Mendelssohn puts this out. And I'll say two more things, and then we can take some questions or comments for the last couple minutes. Obviously, begins to get really on both sides of the Jewish world. And we'll see that a little bit next week, where on the more liberal side, and this is what's going to eventually pave the path for what we know today to be Reform Judaism, people were to say, well, Mendelssohn still... Mendelssohn is still right. Mendelssohn wants to argue that you can completely separate the religious from the civic. But what if our religious observance is actually hindering our ability to participate in the civic, right? What later thinkers are going to say is that if I am, working at an office and I refuse to go to lunch with my coworkers, in some way my religious obligation is hindering my civic participation, right? So that's how Mendelssohn's going to be attacked from the quote unquote more liberal side, is they're going to say, well, he didn't really answer this question, right, for Jews. And maybe Jews need to actually tone down the religious observance, right, or the legalistic part of Judaism and the halachic part, right? That's going to be Avraham Geiger. We'll see that next week. On the right side, there were thinkers that said, Mendelssohn, what are you talking about? You're breaking Jewish tradition in half and coming up with these artificial distinctions between religious and civic. Judaism never knew such distinctions. Jews shouldn't get used to going to German court systems. Jews should continue to ask the rabbi who should pay for the car if somebody bumps into each other. And if it gets confusing, if a Jew bumps into a non-Jewish car, well, then you should take pains to make sure you don't know that many non-Jews, so you don't have to worry about all this conflict, right? This eventually is going to become orthodoxy or ultra-orthodoxy later on as sort of a reaction on the other side to this type of mentality. But Mendelssohn, again, the reason why he's considered the father of the Haskalah is because all modern Jewish movements in some way can be traced back to these categories that Mendelssohn is creating. the religious component of Judaism, that would have been a non-understandable, right? If you ask somebody in the 1500s in the Jewish community, are you a religious Jew? That would not have made any sense to them. Now, after Mendelssohn, he's saying there's a thing called the religious component of Judaism, right? Judaism as a religion, which carries certain religious properties, and that's separate than Jews as people or other parts of Jewish law or Jewish cultural things like that. And he really starts to ask these big picture questions of what is the nature of Jewish obligation and Jewish practice? In other words, what does it mean to be a practicing Jew? Does being a practicing Jew mean you need to follow halacha? Does being a practiced Jew mean you are allowed to use the American court system? You know, all of those questions. And separate, what is the nature of Jews in politics, right? For Mendelssohn, he's saying Judaism has no claim over the political. In other words, right, many people today want to say, you know, Mendelssohn would have been a proto-anti-Zionist. Again, these terms, you know, sort of don't really carry that much meaning because obviously there wasn't a real thing called Zionism he was contending with. But in some way, Mendelssohn was just as happy saying, well, yes, if Jews can achieve full civic rights in a place like France or Germany or America, then Judaism doesn't need any, you know, political entity behind it. So that is Moses Mendelssohn. I know we have a couple of minutes if anybody has thoughts or questions. Go for it.
Okay. So I'm thinking, this was fantastic, first of all. And I'm thinking about at the time of Jesus, and archaeologically, they found that Herod had a palace, one of his many palaces, on the Temple Mount. So you have the Roman Empire sharing the Temple Mount with the temple. And so I think that this concept of civic law versus religious law is embedded way before Mendelssohn. And I just think of that as the best symbolism for that type of thing.
Yeah, I think that's true. And you're definitely right. It's not to say that Jews never lived in systems where they were, you know, had two different legal systems, but it was never considered an ideal. And certainly in the medieval, right, Herod's pretty long ago, and that's even really pre-rabbinic in a lot of ways. Mendelssohn's point is more the rabbinic tradition, the Talmud and the medieval halachic tradition very much was designed to be a standalone court system. You know, Jews had their own way of enforcing punishments in different community. But yeah, you're totally right that if you dip back long enough, right? And there's a reason why people like Mendelssohn, I'll add people like early Zionists, you know, maybe people like you, harken back to the times of, you know, Jewish autonomy in the land of Israel or Jewish residency in the land of Israel, where Jews are actually, right, the last time Jews really had to discuss politics was, you know, the year zero around, right? In the last 2,000 years, you know, Jews never really, you know, had much to do with politics. And so, right, all of a sudden, you know, the Second Temple period and the Bible is going to have a lot more, you know, quote unquote relevance. Mendelssohn also, you know, one of the other interesting things that you reminded me of, a big part of the Haskalah was a return to studying Bible. For the longest time, Jews studied Talmud, right? You go to any traditional Jewish school and you studied Talmud. And yes, you would read the Torah every week in synagogue and blah, blah, blah. But ultimately you studied Talmud. And the Haskalah, right, and again, Mendelssohn was still a person of deep religious obligation and halachic conviction. He was not, you know, he would have, if you would have met Mendelssohn today, his actions would have been indistinguishable from a Orthodox Jew, right? But he started to play around, and, you know, some of his, you know, co-masculine started to play around with this idea of saying, maybe the Bible is more important, right? Not more important, but maybe the Bible should be the center of study because the Bible tackles all these questions that, you know, there's very little in the Mishnah about how to relate to foreign governments, right? You know, the Mishnah has like 6 lines about government. And so you're totally right. All right. I think we have time for one more question, and then I will hopefully see you all next week. Yeah, go for it.
Now, you said, if I'm correct, Mendelssohn was born between 1720 and like 1780. Was his birthday? Was that Kant's?
Both Mendelssohn and Kant were alive in very similar dates. I believe Mendelssohn was 1729 and died sometime in the 1780s. And Kant
Okay,
was,
so did
yeah.
Mendelssohn make any comment about the American Revolution? Or what was happening in the Americas at that time with the Declaration of Independence and the American Constitution, separation of church and state?
I don't believe so. I'm not 100% sure. I don't know if Mendelssohn did or not, but I don't believe so. But that is a good question. I will look into it. But I would be surprised if he did and we didn't know about it. That's sort of, I'm sure he would have agreed with it, but yeah. I mean, it was obviously at the very end of his life and everything there. Yeah. Well, anyway, thank you all. Next week, we're really going to talk about, depending on what perspective, either the challenges to Mendelssohn in the Jewish community or the additions to Mendelssohn in the Jewish community. And people still to this day argue whether or not Mendelssohn should be considered the first Reform Jew, or whether or not Mendelssohn would have, disagreed with Reform. And, those are all, big academic questions, but we could, we'll discuss Abraham Geiger, and we'll see how, in a lot of ways, Geiger is both borrowing from and disagreeing from Mendelssohn next week.
Well, thank you, Daniel. This was such a great class. I agree with what Ria said. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to learn with you as you prepare for your course, and we will look forward to seeing all of you next week, same time, same place. Don't miss it. All right.
Thank you, Daniel. It was great.
No, thank you all. I'll see you all in a week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.